Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for The Future is Women. It's brought to you by the Michigan Women's Commission, and my name is Deidre Bounds. I'm a commissioner with the Michigan Women's Commission. I'm also president of Ignite Social Media. Today, March 24th, 2021, marks Equal Pay Day in the United States. This symbolic date illustrates how far into the new year all U.S. women must work to be paid what all the men in the U.S. are paid for the previous year. But now, as we'll learn from our next speaker, individual symbolic dates are much needed, much further into the year to account for the greater pay gaps specific populations of women face, like Black Women's Equal Pay Day falling on August 3rd this year, or September 8th for Native American women, and Latina Equal Pay Day is October 21st. So it takes us longer into the year to even get to where men are paid by the end of the previous year. The Michigan Women's Commission is committed to helping to solve for these inequities. At today's event, Ruth Archer of the Michigan Bureau of Labor Market Information and Strategic Initiatives will unveil Women in the Michigan Workforce. It's a report on the pay gap for Michigan women and the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Michigan women's employment. Following Ruth's presentation, we will proudly welcome Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer and Julie Rodriguez, who's the director of the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. Governor Whitmer, Ms. Rodriguez, and I will discuss initiatives underway at the state and federal levels to address pay equity and women's economic recovery overall. And I'll note that Ms. Rodriguez graciously agreed to step in today with us to talk about women's economic recovery when our initial guest, Julissa Reynoso, was called out of town. So thank you very much, Ms. Rodriguez, for joining. As folks continue to join into the event via Zoom and YouTube, here's just some quick background on the commission. The Michigan Women's Commission was established by statute in 1968 with duties that include surveying the women of Michigan, identifying challenges they face, and recommending policies to address these challenges. The commission is made up of a 15-member group appointed by the governor to serve 3-year terms. From fall of 2019 until COVID-19 pandemic canceled all of our in-person events in the spring of 2020, the Michigan Women's Commission and Governor Whitmer held conversations with women around the state to hear what they believe are the most pressing issues they face. The women overwhelmingly cited economic security issues as their top concern. Pay equity, affordable and accessible childcare, and a pathway to higher paying jobs was consistently prioritized. And this was before the pandemic put a glaring spotlight on these issues. The commission used these gender equity conversations to craft our current initiatives, and you can learn more about these conversations and our work by going to michigan.gov/MWC. That brings us to today, Equity Pay Day 2021, happening 1 year into an ongoing global pandemic. To give us a clear picture of where Michigan women stand in today's workforce, I'm pleased to introduce Ruth Archer. Ruth is Strategy Officer for the Bureau of Labor, Market Information, and Strategic Initiatives in the Michigan Department of Technology, Management, and Budget, otherwise known as DTMB. So welcome, Ruth, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share some slides here. Okay, hi, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name is Ruth Archer, and I am the Strategy Officer with the Bureau of Labor Market Information and Strategic Initiatives at the state of Michigan. Today, my bureau is releasing our new report, Women in the Michigan Workforce. I'd like to start off by thanking our partners in the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity, especially the Director of Employment and Training, Stephanie Beckhorn, for their support in developing this report. I'd also like to thank the Michigan Women's Commission for the opportunity to discuss our report today. And I'd also really like to thank our research team at the Bureau for their hard work over the last couple of months in putting this report together. The topic of women in the workforce has been deservedly getting a lot of attention recently, especially in light of COVID-19's impacts on the labor market. Recent trends in women's employment is one of the topics that we look at in our report, and we will be discussing it today as well. However, disparate outcomes between men and women in Michigan's workforce have been an issue long before COVID-19. So our report, as well as the discussion that we'll have today, will look at some of these long-standing issues that women face in the workforce as well. Throughout this presentation, there are a few overarching themes related to women in the Michigan workforce that we'll focus on. The first is that women have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19's impact on the labor force compared to men. Female-dominated industries have been hit hard by job losses, and many women have dropped out of the labor force entirely. Although COVID-19 has created a renewed interest in women in the workforce, disproportionate labor force outcomes between men and women were seen long before COVID-19. So this leads us to our second theme. Today is Equal Pay Day, which is the symbolic date that illustrates how far into the next year women must work to be paid the equivalent of what men were paid in the previous year. There's a difference in earnings between men and women in Michigan, with women earning less than men, particularly women of color. We will explore how the intersection of gender and race can affect earnings. And finally, we'll look at poverty. Women are more likely to experience poverty than men at every level of education, from women without a high school diploma to those with a bachelor's degree or higher. We're going to begin by looking at recent trends in women's employment. Some of the industries that have been hardest hit with job losses as a result of COVID-19 are those that are female-dominated. On the right, we see a graph representing the total change in Michigan jobs by industry from February of 2020 to December of 2020. And these industries were the ones that were hardest hit by COVID-19. The industry that has seen the most job losses by far is accommodation and food services, an industry that has sustained nearly 135,000 job losses and is made up of 57% women. Two other industries that have been hit with heavy job losses are healthcare and social assistance at nearly 40,000 job losses, and educational services with over 10,000 job losses. Healthcare and social assistance is made up of 80% women, and educational services is made up of 70% women. The concentration of these job losses in industries that are female-dominated is one example of how COVID-19 has disproportionately affected women. The unemployment rate for women in December of 2020 was estimated at 7.3%, which was more than double their pre-pandemic jobless rate of 2.8%. However, men also had an unemployment rate of 7.3% in December of 2020, meaning that there was actually no difference in the unemployment rate between men and women in December. Men have also seen an increase in their unemployment rate from their pre-pandemic jobless rate of 3.5%. So both genders have had their jobless rates impacted and increased as a result of COVID-19. It's important to note that while the unemployment rate is one important measure of the economy, it doesn't always paint a full picture of how various groups are being affected. More specifically, what's not included in the unemployment rate is the substantial number of women who have dropped out of the labor force. The employment rate represents the percentage of individuals who do not currently have a job but are actively searching for one. Individuals who do not have a job and are not looking for one, in other words, have left the labor force, be that because they lack childcare or they are a discouraged worker, they're not counted as unemployed and they're not going to be represented in the unemployment rate that we just talked about. Between February and December of 2020, approximately 136,000 women in Michigan left the labor force, representing a 5.8% decline in the female workforce. This is compared to a slight increase of about 18,000 men in the labor force. This high number of women leaving the labor force, particularly compared to men, is another example of the disproportionate effect that COVID-19 has had on women in the workforce. Nationally, while all genders experienced a drop in labor force participation rates in April of 2020, women with children under 5 have seen the most unequal recovery since then. The graphs that we see here represent the change in national labor force participation rates for non-parents, parents with children under 5, and parents with children under 18. While all three of these groups have still not fully recovered to their December 2019 labor force participation rates, non-parents have seen the least disparate recovery between men and women between April and December. Both men and women non-parents have seen substantial recovery in their labor force participation rates, with women's rates actually recovering slightly more than men. Having children slightly impacts participation rates overall, but more so for women than men. Parents with children under 18 have seen increases in their participation rates since April of 2020, with December rates within a percentage point for men and women, and women's participation rates still slightly under men. However, for parents with children under 5, men have seen the most recovery, and they are nearly back to their December 2019 labor force participation rates, with women only increasing their participation rate by about 1 percentage point in the same time frame. So this demonstrates not only the disproportionate effect that COVID-19 has had on women in the workforce, but particularly the effect that it's had on women with very young children under 5. While we've just discussed some of the impacts women in the workforce have faced as a result of COVID-19, there are long-standing labor market inequities between men and women that are equally important to investigate. One inequity is that women experience a significant difference in earnings compared to their male counterparts. Women in Michigan who work full-time year-round make 22% less than their male counterparts. Nationally, this pay gap is 18%, meaning that Michigan has a slightly larger gap than the national average. This pay gap increases when you include part-time workers, as women are more likely to work part-time than men. So including part-time workers, women in Michigan make 34% less than their male counterparts. So to kind of put this another way, nationally, women make 82 cents for every dollar that men make. In Michigan, women make 78 cents for every dollar men make. And when comparing all workers, both full-time and part-time, women make 66 cents for every dollar men make. These differences in earnings between men and women mean that women in Michigan are also underrepresented among high earners, accounting for only 1 in 4 people earning more than $100,000 in the state in 2019. These differences in earnings are further exacerbated by race. Race has a substantial impact on earnings for both men and women. We can see that both Black men and Black women earn less than their white counterparts, and the same holds true for Hispanic and Latino individuals. The gap between races is more substantial than the gender gaps within, with Black men only slightly out-earning Black women, and Hispanic and Latino men slightly out-earning Hispanic and Latino women. When comparing those who work full-time year-round, for every dollar white non-Hispanic men make, white non-Hispanic women earn 76 cents, Black and African American women earn 65 cents, and Hispanic and Latino women earn 57 cents. So we can see that the intersection of gender and race can further widen the pay gap, causing women of color to earn less than both men and white women. Unsurprisingly, the pay gap that women face translates into higher overall poverty rates compared to men. Overall, women are more likely to experience poverty than men, with 14% of women falling under the poverty line compared to 11.9% of men. Women are also more likely to experience poverty than men at every level of educational attainment, with women who are less than a high school graduate experiencing the highest poverty rates at nearly 30%. The percentage of women experiencing poverty decreases with educational attainment, with a poverty rate of only 4% for women with a bachelor's degree or higher. Educational attainment also decreases the difference in the poverty rate between men and women within a single level of education. Women who are less than a high school graduate experience poverty at a rate nearly 6 percentage points higher than men. For women with a bachelor's degree or higher, that difference drops to less than 1 percentage point. Although women are more likely to experience poverty at each level of educational attainment, higher levels of educational attainment help reduce the overall rate at which women experience poverty and the poverty rate difference between men and women. So educational attainment is a critical component in reducing the poverty rate among women. The data that we've discussed today can help us understand that women may face different barriers to employment in the labor force, particularly in light of the effects of COVID-19. COVID-19 has caused significant job losses in some major female-dominated industries. We've seen that despite a similar unemployment rate to men, 136,000 women have dropped out of the labor force since February of 2020. As of December 2020, women with children under 5 have seen minimal recovery in their labor force participation rates. Furthermore, women who are working may experience different barriers than their male counterparts. The women who are working full-time year-round experience a substantial wage gap, making 78 cents for every dollar a man makes, a difference that is only exacerbated by race. Women are also more likely to experience poverty than men at every level of education. Understanding these women-specific barriers and differences is critical for creating solutions that will help support women in the workforce. As I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, my bureau, DTMB's Bureau of Labor Market Information and Strategic Initiatives, is releasing a report today about women in the Michigan workforce. So you can find this report after this event has concluded at mylmi.org/research. In our report, we go into further detail about each of the topics that I've discussed here today. And we also look at additional issues such as women's patterns of work, which includes things such as how many women work part-time or work multiple jobs, women's employment by industry and occupation, single parent patterns of work, and more. Additionally, if you're interested in more information and analysis on Michigan's population and labor market in general, please visit our website at michigan.gov/LMI. And you can also find us on Twitter at twitter.com/mylmisi. Thank you again so much for having me here today and for the opportunity to present on women in the Michigan workforce. So I will stop now for questions.
Thank you so much, Ruth. What great information and great detail you provided. You know, as I was listening to you and just thinking about poverty and the impact of poverty on women in Michigan, you know, I couldn't help but think about the trickle down effect of that. And we talk about generational poverty. We talk about, you know, the things that women in Michigan say are important to them, like accessible and affordable childcare. You know, the numbers, the statistics are one thing, but when you think about that in relation to how that applies to real life, it's got a different impact. And so what you've provided to us today really gives us the basis for understanding how all of these things, low pay or inequality in pay and poverty and the labor force, how all of that impacts women and impacts children, and that whole trickle down effect. And I wanted to ask you a few questions, and I'll start off with, there's been a lot of discussion about how the economic crisis of the past year has disproportionately impacted women. And my question for you is this something that we've typically seen in past recessions, or is this something that's really unique for us today? And you layer COVID onto that and the impact of that. So is it something different, or is it more of the same?
So it's something very different. It's not something that we've seen in past recessions. So between the fourth quarter of 2007 and the first quarter of 2009, or what's more commonly referred to as the 2008 recession, about 78% of the job losses were experienced by men. And the unemployment rate increased more for men than women in the 2008 recession, with men having an unemployment rate that was about 2 percentage points higher than for women. So the reason for this was men were overwhelmingly represented in industries such as manufacturing and construction, which were hard hit during that economic downturn. Women were, and still are, more represented in what had previously been considered recession-proof industries, such as healthcare and education. And you'll notice that those are actually two of the industries that I touched on earlier as having sustained heavy job losses as a result of COVID-19. And you'll see similar trends on the effects of manufacturing and construction in the recession that happened in the 2000s as well. So the majority of the previous recessions were generally due to the impacts on the goods producing industries, whereas as a result of COVID-19, while there was that impact on the goods producing industry, we saw a very severe impact on the service industry as well. And I think our report really summarizes this best by stating that, never in the modern economy have female-dominated industries and women in general been hit so hard compared to their male counterparts. And I think it's safe to say that the novelty of this economic downturn and the causes behind it will require extremely innovative solutions compared to some of our prior recessions.
Yeah. And so let me ask you this, when you talk about pay gap increases, and particularly including part-time workers, can you talk a little bit more about the role of part-time work and women in the Michigan workforce? We know a lot of that part-time workers in industries that you mentioned, service industries, those that were hardest hit with COVID. Can you talk a little bit more about that and give us some more perspective?
Sure. So only 57% of women work full-time year-round in Michigan, compared to 71% of men. So in raw numbers, this adds up to about 460,000 less women working full-time than men, which is actually even more stark given that there's 15,000 more women ages 16 to 64 in Michigan. So I think it's also interesting to note that the percentage of women who work part-time varies both by gender and by educational attainment. So I'll share a little bit of the data points that we've put together for our Women in the Michigan Workforce report, because I think these numbers really point to a substantial disparity. So about 21% of women with a bachelor's degree or above worked part-time, compared to 29% of women without a bachelor's degree. And comparatively, only 10% of men with a bachelor's degree work part-time, and 12% of men without a bachelor's degree work part-time. So without throwing too many stats at you, what all these numbers mean is that the percentage of men with a bachelor's degree who work part-time is 11 percentage points lower than it is for women, representing about 86,000 more women with a bachelor's degree that work part-time than men. So as we discussed earlier, these substantial differences in the percentage of men and women who participate in part-time work further negatively impacts the pay gap. So when we include those part-time and full-time workers as part of the pay gap, it widens it to 34% or 66 cents for every dollar that men make.
I scratch my head. It's unbelievable that the pay gap is so drastic, particularly when we're talking about women with families to care for. it's unbelievable. And I have many more questions for you, Ruth, but I think we're running into a time when I have to transition. So what I'll say is, one, thank you so much for sharing all of the data you shared with us today. Very insightful, very helpful for helping us understand the landscape of what we're dealing with as a state, but also nationally. And I know you provided access in terms of links to where people can get more information and where we can add to our knowledge base around this pay gap conversation. So thank you for your time today, and we really appreciate you being with us.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
Awesome. Now, we're going to move to our next segment and our next special guest. I really want to tell you how honored I am and how excited I am to welcome to our event Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And I think you can see her there in the screen. And also, I'd like to welcome Julie Rodriguez. And Julie is the director of the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. Following the news we just heard about women in the Michigan workforce, we're excited to hear what both of you have to say and what you're doing around leading efforts to address women's economic recovery from your leadership positions for the state. And we're going to start with you, Governor Whitmer. You've got lots to share with us. I'd like for you to just take some time and tell us what you're doing and how you're leading that for our state.
All right. Thanks, Deidre. I appreciate it. It's good to see you. I didn't know we were both going to be wearing pink, but I like it.
We got the memo.
My mom used to wear pink when she would go and argue cases in court, and people used to tell her you weren't allowed to do that. She said, pink is my power color. Anyway, I'm glad to be with all of you. And Julie, I'm glad you're here. And it was great to hear Ruth. I am just so impressed by so many women who are taking on leadership roles to help other women. And it's really phenomenal. And of course, Deidre, I'm a huge fan of yours, and Cheryl Bergman, the executive director of our Women's Commission, and Shannon Garrett. And there's so many other incredible commissioners. So I'm really pleased to be with you all. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. It is an extraordinary moment that we're living through, and yet we know that our work ahead is serious and it is real, and maybe it's more crisp than ever why this work is important. The past year has been equal parts historic and heartbreaking, with its fair share of heroism and horror. We've experienced a lot together, and it's a recession on top of a health crisis and a racial reckoning and a flood and an election. And any one of these things alone would have made for an extraordinary year. But all of this is happening under the incredible circumstances of a global pandemic that has swept the world and exacerbated so many underlying issues and challenges faced by families in Michigan and across the country. It's taken nearly 540,000 American lives, 16,000 Michiganders who are not with us any longer. And since the beginning of the pandemic, women have been hit hardest by the COVID layoffs. And as we approach the year mark, or as we just acknowledged the year mark, hundreds of thousands, 275,000 women in January alone have been forced to leave the workforce due to the pandemic. So women's labor force participation hit a 33-year low, and it's been called the SHE-cession for good reason, because a total of 2.4 million women, disproportionately women of color, have left the workforce since February of last year. So I'd like to just quickly reiterate a few of the Michigan-specific data that Ruth mentioned. 136,000 women in Michigan left the workforce between February and December of last year. The unemployment for women in December 2020 was double the pre-pandemic rate. Currently, women in Michigan make 22% less than their male counterparts, which is higher than the national average of 18%. So the gap's bigger here. And it's further exacerbated by race. We know this, but it's important to recognize and talk about the fact that Black women make 65 cents on the dollar and Latinas earn 57 cents on the dollar. So today on Equal Pay Day, during Women's History Month, these employment and pay statistics should remind us all how much work there is left to be done. We often talk about equity and inclusion, but we must always remember these are not only values, but they're calls to action. I'm really proud of the work that my administration's done to center equity in everything we do, from the people we hire to the policies we pursue. One of the first executive directives I signed banned the state from asking potential candidates for jobs about their past salaries during the interview process. I know some people didn't understand why, but we know salary disclosures, voluntary or not, often keep women's salaries lower than those of their male peers. No one seeking employment through the state of Michigan should be asked to divulge their past salaries, and I would like to extend those types of protections to women all across the state of Michigan. I know that every one of us has experienced some form of firsthand the frustration and disappointment that comes with realizing that you are not earning what your male counterpart with whom you have the same credentials is earning. So another area where we've taken a lot of action is childcare. And I think, of course, we need to be clear, childcare is not solely a woman or mother's responsibility, but the reality is that women take on a significantly larger burden of childcare responsibilities in heterosexual relationships. And millions of women across the country and thousands in Michigan have cited childcare as the primary driver of leaving the workforce during COVID. The data we saw in Ruth's presentation shows women with children have seen the most unequal job recovery. So investments in childcare are clearly beneficial to children and their families, and they'll uplift our economy and power us to new highs. And that's why in my budget proposal, I included $370 million investment in childcare, which will help 150,000 Michigan families. In some cases, it'll bring the cost of childcare to zero. So amidst all these colliding crises that we're living through, we have to double down and do more in this space. So in addition to this historic investment, I'm grateful that the Women's Commission, so thank you for the work that you're doing to administer the Tri-Share Child Care Program. It's an innovative program that splits the cost of child care 3 ways between the employer, the employee, and the state. Thanks to you, the pilot's underway, and I've recommended an additional $2.2 million to expand that in 2022. So in addition to childcare, and expanding education and career opportunities for women has been another priority for my administration. Ruth's report tells us that the percentage of women experiencing poverty decreases as their educational attainment increases, which is why Michigan Reconnect and the Futures for Frontliners programs that we established to give adults 25 and over an opportunity to upskill is so important. To improve Futures for Frontliners, we launched a $5 million pilot for 400 single parents currently enrolled in the program to provide them with wraparound services like childcare, transportation, career counseling, technological assistance. These services give single parents pursuing career advancing educational opportunities the help they need to stay in their programs and graduate and get that skill that gets them into a higher wage job. So we're going to monitor this closely and see how effective it is and continue the work in this space to create paths to opportunity. So with the cooperation of the legislature, I know we can extend these programs. And despite all the areas where we don't find common ground, we have around skills enhancement. And this is a great thing for the people of our state. We've got to continue to look at the data. We've got to continue to be nimble so that we can address the shortcomings and the barriers that women are confronting. But I'm really confident that we are up to this challenge. So through my life and career in public service, I've always advocated for women to have more seats at the table, and not just seats, but empowered roles at the table. America's beauty and strength lies in our diversity, and we've got to reflect that diversity at the highest levels of public, private, and nonprofit work. It means more women, more people of color, more members of the LGBTQ plus community, more members of different religious backgrounds and racial backgrounds. This is so important, and empowered leadership roles. We all deserve representation because presence is power. And for too long, marginalized groups have been kept out of rooms where decisions are made that impact us all. Perspectives are essential, voices are invaluable, and presence is a must. So over the long arc of history, women and people of color have secured footholds in the halls of power, shattering ceilings and breaking down barriers that were meant to keep us out. In my lifetime, we've gone from 1 woman senator to 24 today, from 13 women in the House to 118 today. from 4.5% of state legislators to 30.9%. 22 are heads of state globally, up from 4, and governors. I mean, the day I was born, there were 0 women governors in the United States, and it had only ever had 4 up until then. Today, there are 8 serving concurrently. It would be 9, but Gina Raimondo just went to be our Secretary of Commerce in the Biden administration. So women continue to rise. And as we do, we are addressing the issues that women across the country are confronting. We'll keep getting things done. We will not stop. And on this Equal Pay Day and Women's History Month, this meeting of the Michigan Women's Commission, let's recommit ourselves to doing all we can to ensure women in Michigan pursue their potential. Let's create a more equitable, just Michigan for all. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Governor. Thank you so much. I love hearing you say presence is power, because we talk a lot about having a seat at the table, and we want more than a seat at the table. We want our voices heard, and we want to make sure that when we're heard, which we can clearly tell that you listen to all the women around the state when they said affordable childcare. Access to affordable childcare was important, and we thank you for all you're doing to make it easier for women to do the things they need to do to take care of their families.
Thanks, Deidre.
With that, I'd like to transition to Julie Rodriguez. Julie, I gave you a brief introduction, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what's happening in the Biden-Harris administration and what you guys are doing around the Gender Policy Council.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for having me today, Deidre. Thank you so much, Governor Whitmer, for your inspiring words and tremendous leadership, as we've seen time and time again. And thank you to the Michigan Women's Commission for having me here today. And, I'm so excited to be able to share with you all some of the key priorities on gender at the White House, and to also be able to dig deeper into the critical topic of today's discussion. How do we really address the income and wage gap that impacts women across the country? And how are we going to build back better for working women? This conversation comes at the close of what's been a very exciting and busy month for the Biden-Harris administration on gender issues. Earlier this month, you all may have seen on International Women's Day, President Biden announced an executive order formally establishing the White House Gender Policy Council that will be reporting directly to the president. Now, this council represents one of the most significant elevations of gender equity and equality across our administration to date. And we really intend to make this a whole of government effort throughout the administration, including as members of the cabinet are nominated, confirmed, and are joining the council. And so we're tackling an extensive list of issues, as many of the speakers have already spoken about, including working to combat systemic bias and discrimination, increasing women's economic security, and addressing the structural barriers facing working women today, addressing caregiving needs of American families and supporting our care workers, strengthening efforts to prevent and respond to gender-based violence, ensuring access to comprehensive health care, and promoting equity and opportunity in education and leadership. For us, strengthening women's economic security and ensuring their full and fair participation in the labor market are absolutely critical to tackling these issues, especially as we continue to really build back better and coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic. And conversations about pay equity and women's economic recovery are really, really critical in the context of COVID-19, as you all heard. A year into this pandemic, it is clear that women have been disproportionately impacted by the combined public health crisis and the ensuing economic crisis and caregiving crisis. The pandemic has exacerbated barriers that have historically impacted women and girls, and especially women and girls of color, forcing many to leave the workforce, manage virtual schooling for their children, and absorb additional caregiving responsibilities. Now, many women are also on the front lines of responding to COVID-19 as essential workers, keeping our economy, communities, and families going, but often without some of the essential protections and benefits that all workers deserve. Now, the pandemic's economic impact is stunning. We've heard from many that, although women comprise just 39% of the global workforce, they account for 54% of pandemic-related job losses. We heard the term SHE-cession earlier that the governor mentioned. In the US, job loss among women has eviscerated more than 30 years of progress in labor force participation just over the course of the last year. And women in many countries are more likely to be employed in sectors that have been devastated by the crisis, including education, hospitality, and retail services, or concentrated in the informal economy, working as market vendors or domestic workers, and therefore especially vulnerable to unemployment and the lack of basic protections. And millions more women have had to take a step back from their jobs, working part-time or dropping out intermittently, as they have been forced to take on the additional burdens at home with schools remote and childcare centers closed. So we know that as we look to rebuild our economy, the essential components of reopening our schools and ensuring affordable childcare are critical to that effort. And this is what the current economic crisis looks like for women across the country. But we also recognize that the economic landscape women were facing before the pandemic was far from perfect. It's clearer than ever today as we, mark the important day of Equal Pay Day, as we're celebrating here at the White House with the U.S. soccer women's team. But it's clearer than ever today that the income gap, that is represented, that we still have so much work to do and so much to be able to reach gender equality and gender equity in our workplaces. And that's why we're devoted to building our economy back better and to investing in key industries where we know women are an important part of that workforce. We need an economic recovery that's not only bringing women back into the workforce, but also breaks down the barriers facing women, especially women of color, who are unseen, undervalued, and underpaid in the workplace. We have started that work, with the American Rescue Plan, which promises immediate relief for working families who have been hit hard by this pandemic, and it takes critical steps in addressing issues fundamental to advancing our economic recovery that works for women. As I mentioned, including opening our schools safely, expanding paid sick and family leave and medical leave, and addressing our country's caregiving crisis. Now, I want to take a moment to just highlight the last of these, the caregiving crisis. And I know the governor spoke to this as well. The pressure that the pandemic has put on our caregiving infrastructure has compounded the effects of the economic downturn, as women have borne the brunt of increased caregiving demands. In a recent survey of workers, more women than men cite caregiving responsibilities as the reason why they left their job in the first place. And more women than men have said that they anticipate losing paid work because of unpaid caregiving responsibilities. Now, addressing our country's caregiving crisis is essential to building an economy that works for women. And that's why in the American Rescue Plan, we have included numerous provisions addressing working families' urgent need for affordable and accessible childcare. These provisions include expanding the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, which benefits working families and low-wage workers directly and helps cover the cost of childcare. The plan also invests $40 billion directly into childcare, keeping thousands of providers from closing their doors, increasing pay and benefits for childcare workers, and ensuring that parents can go back to work. Addressing the needs of our caregiving workforce and the millions of families who depend on care workers is central to ensuring a full economic recovery for women. And there are other steps that we can and need to take now to be able to build towards a stronger and more inclusive economy, especially as we work towards pay equity, because ensuring that equal pay becomes a reality for all requires more than just words. We can start by holding employers accountable for engaging in systemic discrimination and ensure our enforcement agencies have the tools to start dramatically increasing funding for enforcement so that employers are held accountable. And we need to pass comprehensive legislation like the Paycheck Fairness Act, which would protect workers' paychecks and work to end pay discrimination while leveling the negotiating playing field for women and people of color. We know the Paycheck Fairness Act would remove loopholes in the law that allow employers to justify gender-based pay disparities. And the bill will also make it easier for groups of workers to join together when they face the same type of discrimination, and to hold employers accountable for engaging in systemic discrimination that often leads to underpay and undervaluing women and people of color in the workplace. And critically, it would also make major steps towards increasing pay transparency, including by protecting workers from retaliation for discussing their wages with their colleagues. This is common sense. It is about ensuring everyone is paid fairly, but it is more than that. Women are the breadwinners for many families today. And if they are making less than men do, it means families are getting by on less. We still have a lot of work to do to advance women's economic recovery, and that work is critical to ensuring every American is given a fair shot to get ahead in this country. So today on Equal Pay Day, we recognize the role that equal pay plays in building back better for everyone. Thank you all again for having me.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you, Julie. Thank you so much. You hit on so many things in your talk, and I think you actually answered a lot of what I was going to ask you in my next question. But I want to talk a little bit about this idea of pay transparency. The governor hit on this, you also hit on it, and yes, there's equity, but pay transparency, I think, is another important area that we tend to forget about, or not really think about. You talked about the Paycheck Fairness Act and those kinds of things, but are there other things that we should think about on how we solve this disparity and how we help women who are facing those types of things in the workplace? So outside of pay transparency and outside of equitable wages and equitable pay, are there other things that employers should think about, or things that we can do in the workplace to help women?
Yes, definitely. Pay equity, I think, is a critical and important part of it, but it is just one step. It is the other components that we talked about that I think, the American Rescue Plan has made significant investments in, and I think will be able to show that when we, make these investments, they're good for, women, they're good for working families, and they're good for our, local economies. And those are things like providing paid leave policies that support women and families, and making childcare more affordable. Also, schedules more predictable and flexible. I mean, the stories that I've heard in terms of, employers being able to switch schedules and, make changes sort of last minute that impact, a family's ability to plan for, needed childcare and ensure that they're able to meet their obligations both at work and at home. It means also achieving greater, diversity within occupations and ensuring that the number of women, especially women of color, are able to move up in the ranks and attain higher level positions and jobs within leadership. And it means, ending all forms of workplace discrimination and harassment that we know continue to, impact so many cultures of workplaces today. So it is really looking holistically. But we know pay equity is a critical part of that, and it's a critical, foundational part that, we all need to continue to fight for. But it's also these other components that will continue to make a difference for working women and our families.
Absolutely. As a business owner in Michigan, a lot of that is part of what I have to do every day with my company, particularly during COVID, is, I have women who have children. They have to, I have this rule of you're not allowed to say sorry when your kids are talking to you or crying in the background on a conference call, because we're all in this together. So you can't be sorry for what your children are doing. I forbid any of my staff from saying they're sorry when their kids are needing their attention. Governor Whitmer, question for you. For Michigan women who plan to re-enter the workforce and their concerns about the state of the economy limiting their opportunities and having difficulty finding jobs that match their existing skill sets, what kinds of programs are in place to help them upskill or reskill, and how can we more widely disseminate information about those resources?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Deidre. This is something that we've been really focused on well before the pandemic, frankly, when we set our 60 by 30 goal in my first state of the state to get to 60% of our population a post-secondary certificate or degree by 2030. So we're working on accomplishing that goal on a number of different fronts. The Michigan Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity offers a lot of different programs to support women in overcoming barriers, and so that we can get skills and training and education necessary to take that next step in their professional lives, get into a better paying job as well. Programs include things like assessments to better understand the unique needs of each individual woman, matchmaking tools to connect them to the best training provider, educational institution, or other entity so that they can take formal steps down that path. Programs to help them obtain free or low-cost credentials or degrees opportunities, such as Futures for Frontliners, which I mentioned earlier, and the Michigan Reconnect. Information on opportunities to participate in work-based learning. And when we think about things like registered apprenticeships or career and tech ed programs, and compiled resources to support their professional development, such as the Return to Work Playbook and Pure Michigan Talent Connect. Visiting LEO's website, it's michigan.gov/LEO, and clicking on the employment and training button can quickly connect women to our agencies and services that can support them. And it's also a great idea to reach out to their local Michigan Works agency, as they may have additional opportunities and connection points on that localized level. And you know what, Deidre, I love your rule. We don't apologize for our children bugging us. That's my daughter texting me that interrupted my spiel just now. And I'm not sorry, but I'm not answering.
Not sorry. Good. Perfect. Don't be sorry. So I just want to reiterate michigan.gov/Leo for information around the programs the governor was just mentioning. So now here's a question for either of you or both of you. Can you talk a little bit more about how the pandemic has specifically exacerbated economic barriers for women of color? If you haven't noticed, I'm a Black woman, and this issue of women of color, being not just making less than men, but making even less than other women in this country is important to us. So how from the president's administration and also from your perspective, Governor Whitmer, what are you doing and what are things that we consider to help break down those barriers for women of color?
Julia, do you want to go first?
Go for it, Governor, please.
Okay, all right, I'll jump in and then you can add from your perspective. The pandemic's taken a huge toll on communities of color. The pandemic itself took a huge toll on communities of color. And obviously our statewide economy and the recovery has been uneven. It's disproportionately impacted women of color. The data that we saw today demonstrates exactly that. And that's why it's important we're intentional about centering our work of our recovery plans around women and women of color in particular. We've got to confront systemic racism head on and in all aspects of government's economy, employment, healthcare, education, everywhere. The budget that I proposed last month makes real significant investments in education, childcare, infrastructure, and workforce programs, all of which the part of our North Star is the equity lens that we're really focused on. In terms of, perspective, I do think that I am proud of my lived experience as a daughter and a mom and a woman, and I'll continue to use that experience to uplift and create a level playing field for people who don't have it. And we have to recognize what that means. There are certain experiences that I will never understand because I have lived as a white woman my whole life. And as a white woman, I know the inequities I face as a woman are not compounded by my race. Women of color in Michigan and across the country face structural barriers that fellow white women and I do not. And as a policymaker and a leader, it's incumbent on us to recognize that despite all the expert advice and data we may have access to, we'll never know the power of the lived experience. And so we have an imperative to inject intersectionality into everything we do. We have to take steps to listen, to bring in more voices, to center racial and gender equity in every decision we make, every person we hire, every statement we release. Since I was sworn in as governor, I'm really proud that We've made it a top priority to include more women of color, more people of color, more women, more members of the LGBTQ plus community at our policymaking tables. And I think it shows what happens when you do that. Dr. Janae Caldoun, our chief medical executive, was one of the first people in the country to see the demographic data around COVID and what it meant, and drove our efforts to reach out, to educate, to create better access to healthcare and information. And we've saved a lot of lives, not just in Michigan, but other states learned from our example. And it was because Dr. Caldoun is a Black woman, and she's looking at these things that maybe other experts who are well-intentioned but didn't have her lived experience weren't necessarily appreciating what it meant. I appointed Poppy C.S. Hernandez as the executive director of our first ever equity and inclusion office. Poppy is developing diversity and inclusion strategies, not only within my executive office, but collaborating across state government. So we can't just stop at state government. We've got to extend these types of efforts and partner with the private sector and the nonprofit sector, because it's important that we live our values, that we do what we can in our spaces, but we do what we can to make this available to everyone.
Julie.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Governor. I'll just add on top of that, I think we were really excited about, again, passage of the American Rescue Plan, because it did include so many significant, we think, sort of investments that really, helped to demonstrate, I think, the kind of, important intersectionality that you mentioned, Governor Whitmer, and to, really begin to see, I think, the important opportunities that we have to be able to address long-standing systemic issues in a way that is actually, beginning to lift up, individuals, industries, and communities. I think, to go back to the caregiving component as one aspect of that, I think the critical investments there we know are significant in impacting women of color in the workforce, just given the demographics across, many health and home care workers. But we also know that future investments are critical. So, Governor, you mentioned earlier the need for education, workforce development, training. And so we're excited about kind of our infrastructure efforts and investments as we think about our Build Back Better agenda. But we know that that also includes the caregiving economy that we continue to talk about, that when we think about infrastructure in our country, yes, it's the roads and bridges and critical infrastructure, but it's also the important human infrastructure and sort of human capital that we continue to build out that we know really, has been a critical part of the kind of work and support and services that women of color have been engaged in within our country. And so I'm excited about, just sort of what's on the horizon, and to see what amazing, leaders like Governor Whitmer will be able to do to really be able to, kind of catalyze and further catapult the innovation that she's already embarked on to really be able to bring equity and racial justice to the forefront of her efforts.
Wonderful. Thank you. I have one last question for you both. Should be pretty quick. What can women or men, or whoever's joining us today, watching us today, what can they do to help women's economic recovery in Michigan? Governor, we'll start with you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. Well, I think it's really important to speak up and to speak out, to advocate for the issues that you care about in your communities, in your workplaces, to make your priorities heard. I need your help too. Call and write and meet with your state legislators. Julie has just highlighted the American Rescue Plan. The Biden administration has given us this incredible opportunity, and the legislature needs to hear from the people they represent that it's time to get these dollars deployed and to move swiftly. And they have not on the last plan, much less on the one that is coming. Every day matters, and every opportunity is important. So I think those are the ways that people can really make a difference here.
Thank you. Julie, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I'll just add, I think, in an age of social media, we all have kind of our platforms and our, ability to get our, make our voices heard, as you mentioned, Governor, and to be able to share our stories and our lived and personal experiences. I know that coming from an organizing background, I know the importance of really sharing that personal story and having those personal connections to be able to move people's hearts and minds around the issues that we care most about. So, I'll just echo what the governor mentioned is really use your voices, use your platforms. And, we look forward to hearing from you as well as we start to build out our Gender Policy Council.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for being here today. Thank you for sharing with us today. Thank you for being so open with your feedback and your comments. Thank you, Governor, for your daughter calling to prove my point of not saying sorry when your kids are needing you. And I also just want to send a big shout out and a thank you to Ruth Archer for presenting the DTMB's Women in the Michigan Workforce Report. There's a lot of work ahead of us. We're confident that we're on the right path to moving forward, particularly with women at the helm, like the two of you. And so I just want to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank our guests for tuning in today. I want to also share that a recording of this event will be posted on the Michigan Women's Commission website at michigan.gov/MWC. And it'll also be available on our YouTube channel. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, as well as LinkedIn if you want to find out more about what events the Commission has coming up and any other opportunities. And on behalf of the Michigan Women's Commission, I look forward to working with all the folks around our state to make this our last equity pay day needed and to ensure successful economic recovery for us all. So thank you everyone for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day. We appreciate you. Take care.